So welcome everyone. It's Logano Philosophical Lobby. I don't want to be really so as I said that already in Geneva a few days ago, so I'm going to repeat it here because I stand by my claim. This man needs no introduction. Actually, this means that he needs no introduction in a philosophical audience.
He's introduced me twice now.
Yes, exactly. So, it needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it twice. So really, in a philosophical audience, it really needs no introduction. That doesn't mean, of course, if he walks in a room with Keith Richards, people start saying like, oh, who is this fellow with Gonzalo, right? That's not that kind of thing. But you literally hear, because his work in philosophy and particularly metaphysics is nothing, literally nothing short of outstanding. Like he has written about truth-making, he's written about ontological nihilism. He has written about, most influentially, about nominalism and about the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to focus here on the last two. A professor, another great metaphysician that is actually a professor here, I'm not going to say who, you can guess, once told me that his defense of nominalism is the second best defense available on the market. You can actually argue, guess which one is the first. and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about a little book which is very dear to my heart, because I chatted with him about it with Gonzalo, which is the last book that he published, which is called Two Arguments for the Identity of Indiscernibles. This is just a philosophical masterpiece. So if you want to have a discussion on formulations of the PII, just look no farther than chapter 1. Yeah. If you want to have a thorough discussion and new arguments and new take on what are called the trivializing properties, that is, what are the allowable properties that in one formulation will go in the range of the second order quantifier, you should go look no farther than chapter 2. If you want to have a thorough discussion of the extant defense or counterexamples to the PII, look no farther than chapter 3 and chapter 4, and if you want to do new arguments, just look no farther than chapter 5. I'm describing the thing because I think it's an amazing feat about this little book, because it's just under 50 pages long, right?
No, 50,000 words.
Yeah, 50,000 words. So it's philosophy at its best in the following sense. It's just a one continued sustained argument for one thesis. You take one piece out, okay? It's just not the individual argument, right? It's like the whole thing. In one sense, literally is one case in which you want to say that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And I think we don't see that in philosophy at all. Right? You take one piece out, I'm not going to say that everything crumbles, but it really hangs on together, which I think is a marvelous feat of the book. He's also an expert on Leibniz. As a matter of fact, he published in 2014 a book that I buy and I didn't read. So about Leibniz and the principle of identity of indiscernibles, and he just actually published, edited and commented and translated thoroughly the Discourse on Metaphysics by Leibniz. All of these books are available by Oxford University Press at a reasonable price, and they make great Christmas gifts. Right? I have a percentage. Come on in. Here, there's yeah. Okay, so after this, I honestly don't know what that's like. I want to actually thank, because I didn't do that in Geneva. I actually want to thank everyone that made this possible. Paolo Gili that thought about the invitation, Mariani that helped us, Léon that actually helped us with the things, Cristian that yesterday actually put it was a wonderful dinner. So, and all the faculty and all the people I don't know. So without further ado, he is a great philosopher, a great friend, and perhaps more surprisingly, a great tennis player. So Gonzalo Rodriguez-Pereyra, which is going to talk about the two actually combined of his expertise, because it's going to talk about Bolzano, which is the Bohemian Leibniz, right? And the identity of indiscernibles. Gonzalo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those kind, exaggerated, inflated words, Claudio. You have been a friend for a long time. From now on, you're going to be my agent too.
That's
exactly. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and particularly Damiano, Paolo, Léon, Cristian, for organizing the event and inviting me. So I think I can see everyone has a handout. And basically, the handout contains whole talk, basically. So what I am going to do is to read a passage from Bolzano's Wissenschaft letter, where he argues for the principle of identity of indiscernibles, or PII, as I will call it. And I will make some comments on the passage and reconstruct the argument and make some comments on the argument. So the passage is in the first page of your handout, and there Bolzano says, one of the most difficult questions is whether there must be some difference between any two objects where there actually are two and not just one object represented twice. One might already respond in the affirmative based upon the reason that for any two objects, alpha and beta, there must at least obtain the difference that alpha has the attribute of being alpha and not beta, and beta the opposite attribute. But this is only an external difference. But it seems that if we ask whether there is a difference between any two objects, we will not be satisfied with a merely external difference between them, which we'll already obtain if we distinguish them in thought. But rather, we ask whether there is an inner attribute which the one has and the other lacks. I am inclined to think that such an inner difference must hold between any two objects that have actual existence. In other words, I think that there are no two actual objects that equal one another in all their internal attributes. So this is basically the first part of the passage, because there Bolzano is explaining the thesis he maintains. The thesis is going to be arguing for, right? And the thesis is basically that two numerical objects must always differ with respect to an internal attribute or with respect to an internal property. In the second part of the passage, he's going to give his argument for that thesis. But at that point, he introduces a footnote that reads, the reader will notice that I have referred to this theorem already several times under the name of the Leibnizian maxim, the Identitate Indiscernibilium. And now he goes for his reasons. He says, my reasons are as follows. Every finite substance is influenced by every other substance, no matter how far they are apart. Thus, even if we make the most extreme assumption, namely that the original attributes of two substances, i.e., the attributes that stem from the creator himself, are completely equal, an undisturbed equality of the two substances can continue only so long as both are surrounded by equal substances acting upon them from the same distances. Or, if there is an inequality in one of these parts, then this difference must be of such a sort that its effects are the same for both substances. But both of these assumptions are infinitely improbable because of the infinitely many different cases that have the same probability. It is certain that at least in most cases, there is not only one, but many, nay, infinitely many, external and internal differences that can be truly stated of two objects. The more closely we compare two people, or two trees, or any other two actual objects, the more differences we discover between them. So that's the passage. And I totally agree with Bolzano that the question of PII is one of the most difficult questions in philosophy. Now, it seems to me that he's a bit confused about how that question is supposed to be formulated or what that question is. Because if you look at the top of the passage, he says that the question is whether there must be some difference between any two objects. And I think that's, I mean, there is a misunderstanding there. That is not what the question of PII is. In other words, PII is not the thesis or the principle that whenever there are two objects, there must be some difference between them, right? Because one way in which objects can differ is numerically, right? And so if the question is simply whether two objects must differ in some way or another, one possible answer is that, of course, any two objects must differ, because any two objects are two numerically different objects, so a fortiori they differ numerically. So the question will be responded immediately in an affirmative way. But not only will the question be not only will the answer be trivial, the main point is that that answer will not be answering the question of PII, will not be actually establishing PII, because PII is not the thesis that any two objects must differ. PII is the claim that any two numerically different objects must differ in some other way than merely numerically. In other words, it is the thesis that whenever there is numerical difference, there must be an extra numerical difference too, right? That is the question. Whenever there is it true that whenever there is numerical difference, whenever there are two objects, those two objects also maintain an extra numerical difference? Now, Bolzano, I think, senses some of this because he's clearly dissatisfied with answering the question of PII by saying, yes, PII is true, because if you take two different objects, alpha and beta, they are going to differ with respect to the property of being alpha and not beta. One of them, alpha, will have that property or that attribute. The other one, beta, will not have it, will lack it. He's clearly dissatisfied with that. So I think he's sensing that there is an issue here. But he doesn't realize, I believe, that the issue is the formulation of the question, and in particular, the way in which he formulated the question, rather than that possible answer. Right? And he also seems to, in my view, he seems to be confused about what is wrong with answering the question of PII by referring to these attributes, like being identical to A or being identical with A and not with B. He is dissatisfied with that because he says, oh, that will be a merely external difference, right? But that cannot be the problem, because if I am right that the question is whether, given a numerical difference between two objects, there must also be an extra numerical difference, then there is no reason why we should rule out external differences per se, right? So the simple fact that the difference is external shouldn't be the problem, because the question of PII is whether numerical difference must be accompanied by extra numerical difference of any kind, whether internal, external, model, no model, whatever. And also there is another issue with his particular example. He's talking about the property or attribute of being identical with alpha and not with beta. And of course, that is an external difference because that is a conjunctive property, one of whose conjuncts, the second one not being identical with beta, is relational, right? You cannot be not identical with beta unless you bear a relation to something external to you. But he didn't have to use that predicate or that property or that attribute. He could have simply appealed to the predicate or attribute or property of being identical with alpha, which alpha must have, but beta must lack. So there is already a difference there, right? So I just wanted to make those points about the way Bolzano formulates PII and what he says about a possible answer, and we might discuss that later. But now I want to move on and make a brief comparison between Bolzano and Leibniz on PII. As Claudio said, Bolzano has also been called the Bohemian Leibniz, right? Because he was from Bohemia, and also he was inspired and influenced by Leibniz, and the relationship between these two philosophers is very interesting. Because Bolzano follows Leibniz in many ways, but not in every possible way. For instance, they both believe in the principle of identity of indiscernibles, but Leibniz is famous for accepting the principle of sufficient reason, and Bolzano rejects the principle of sufficient reason, right? And that also puts a constraint on the similarity of their positions with respect to PII, because some of the best most powerful arguments by Leibniz for PII are based on the principle of sufficient reason. Now, Bolzano, of course, cannot avail himself of those arguments because he doesn't believe in the principle of sufficient reason. There are other interesting differences between Bolzano and Leibniz. For instance, Leibniz famously rejected causation between finite substances. And Bolzano, as you can see from that passage, is also an extremist like Leibniz, but in the other direction. He says that all substances are causally connected with each other, right? So that's a huge difference between the two philosophers. There is another, one thing I should mention here when comparing Leibniz and Bolzano, and this is just an anecdote, I suppose. I should have mentioned this first, is that footnote that I read when he says, I have referred to this principle many times already under the name of the Leibnizian maxim, the Identitate Indiscernibilium. That's completely false. He never referred to that principle in that manner at all before that. That's the only time he refers to it in that way. But that's just by the way. So more importantly is the claim that Leibniz, in my view, when he argues for PII, he argues for the necessary truth or necessity of PII. Right? So he believes that PII is true, but it is true because it is necessarily true. Now, Bolzano, as you can see, as I hope you can see, because that, I mean, as I read that passage, and I'd like to see what you think about it, as I read that passage, he's not arguing for the necessity of PII. Either he's arguing for the truth of PII, the bare truth of PII, without making any commitment to the modality of that truth, without making any commitment to whether it is contingently true or necessarily true, or perhaps he's arguing not even for the truth of PII, but for its high probability. But I don't see much evidence in the passage. I actually see no evidence at all that he's arguing for the necessity of PII. So that's another important difference between Leibniz and Bolzano. And I should like to say that the evidence that he is not arguing for the necessity of PII in that passage is not that he keeps referring to actual objects. Right? He keeps saying things like there are no actual objects, no two actual objects which share all their inner attributes and things like that. So to our 21st century ears, that might sound as if what he's arguing for is simply the actual truth of PII rather than the necessary truth. But I don't think we should, I don't think that that's the evidence for the claim that he's not arguing for the necessary truth of PII. Because Bolzano scholars have told me that when he uses the word actual, he doesn't mean the same as what we, 21st century philosophers, mean by actual. Instead, by actual or actual object, he means what we might mean by the word or phrase concrete object, right? So the conclusion there is that there are no two concrete objects that have all their inner properties or intrinsic properties in common. My evidence for thinking that he's not arguing for the necessary truth of PII is simply that I fail to see in that passage a model qualifier. It is true that he uses the word must on at least one occasion and perhaps two, but I take that word to signify that he takes his argument to be conclusive, right? And of course, the fact that one takes an argument to be conclusive is not the same as taking the conclusion of the argument to be necessary. And finally, let me mention another difference between Bolzano and Leibniz. Leibniz and Bolzano believed in very strong versions of PII, in the sense that they believe not simply that whenever there is a numerical difference, there must be an extra numerical one. They believe that whenever there is a numerical difference, there must be an intrinsic difference between the two objects in question, right? So they believed in what is sometimes called the strong or strongest version of PII, namely the one that says no two objects share all their intrinsic properties in common or all their inner attributes in common. So they both agreed in that, but there is a subtle difference between them. I think Leibniz's version of PII is even stronger than Bolzano, because although Leibniz didn't want any two objects to differ with respect to their intrinsic properties, he also thought that no two objects could differ quantitatively or could differ in size unless they also differ qualitatively, right? So he thought that the difference in size had to be based or had to supervene upon a qualitative difference. So Leibniz's principle is really, really strong. He claims that no two objects can differ with respect to their intrinsic qualitative properties, where intrinsic qualitative properties exclude things like size. Bolzano, on the other hand, doesn't make that restriction in the passage we have read. And actually, I have evidence that in other parts of the Wissenschaftlehre, he is willing to count a difference in size as an intrinsic or an inner difference, which suggests that his version of PII, the one he's arguing for in this passage, is slightly weaker than Leibniz, because for all he tells us, it might be that there are two objects which differ only in size. Right? Given that size for him is an intrinsic attribute, they will still satisfy PII. Okay, so those are my comments about the relationship between Bolzano and Leibniz. So let me now go into my reconstruction of the argument. And this is in the second page of your handout. So there is a first premise that says the internal attributes of any finite substance are a causal effect of all other substances. An intermediate conclusion, and this is line number 2, it says, therefore, for there to be no internal difference between two given substances, they must not only have been given equal original attributes by God, but they must be surrounded by perfectly similar substances at the same distance, or by dissimilar substances that have exactly the same effects upon them. Then there is another premise, number 3, that says, for every distribution of substances across space in which two substances A and B are surrounded by perfectly similar substances at the same distance, or in which A and B are surrounded by dissimilar substances causally affecting them in exactly the same manner, there are infinitely many other equiprobable distributions of substances across space in which A and B are surrounded by some dissimilar substances causally affecting them in a different way. Then we have another intermediate conclusion. Number 4, therefore, it is infinitely improbable that any two substances, A and B, are surrounded by perfectly similar substances at the same distance, or that they are surrounded by dissimilar substances that have exactly the same effects upon them. And then 5 is the final conclusion. Therefore, there are no two actual, that is, concrete objects that share all their qualitative internal attributes. Perhaps I should have written just internal attributes, given the comparison I made a moment ago between Bolzano and Leibniz. Right, so the basic idea behind the argument is that all substances are causally connected with each other, and that the properties, including the intrinsic properties of the substance, are always a causal effect of its interaction with other substances, and that basically that the properties a substance has depends obviously not only on the causal interactions that substance has with other substances, but also on the properties of the substances with which it interacts. And so he thinks, look, for there to be two substances having exactly the same properties, they must be interacting in the same way, right? At the same, surrounded by substances at the same distance, interacting in the same way with substances which are perfectly similar, with substances that have the same property. If two things interact in the same way or are surrounded at the same distance by substances which have the same properties, those substances surrounding those things are going to affect them in the same way. And so they're going to produce in them the same effects, right? So there won't be any difference between them. But there is another possibility, which is that the two perfectly similar substances in question are not surrounded by perfectly similar things at the same distance. They are surrounded by dissimilar things at the same distance. But for some reason, these dissimilar things are such that from that distance, they cause the same effects on the two initial substances. And so the two initial substances have the same properties. They're similar. So the basic idea is that for two substances to be perfectly similar, for two substances to share all their internal, inner, or intrinsic properties or attributes, the substances with which they causally interact must have exactly the same effects upon them. And what he says is that that is not true because it is highly improbable. And it is highly improbable because there are infinitely many cases in which the two initial substances are surrounded by substances which causally affect them in different ways, are surrounded by substances which produce different effects in them, are surrounded by substances, say, which make one of them red, but the other one pink, one of them hot, but the other one cold, one of them square, and the other one, I don't know, round or triangular, something else. Therefore, he concludes, the fact that there are two substances sharing all their intrinsic properties is highly improbable, which is to say that PII is highly probable. And from that, he infers that PII is true. So that's basically the argument. That's basically the argument how I understand it. And that's basically how I have reconstructed it. Now, I think the argument, as I have reconstructed it, is invalid. And it is invalid for two reasons. One more important than the other. So the less important one first. I mean, you can easily see that the conclusion of the argument speaks about all actual objects or all actual concrete objects, right? But the premises of the argument only speak about substances. So the only way in which this argument can be valid is if for Bolzano, all objects are substances, all actual objects, all concrete objects are substances. But that is not the case. Bolzano had a dualistic ontology, if you want. There were substances on the one hand, and what he called adherences on the other hand. And adherences were also it was also a mixed category for him, because there he included what nowadays people call tropes, namely qualities which are unique to a substance, and therefore they depend on the substance. But he also included their events. So the argument as formulated is invalid because in his ontology, not all substances are, not all objects are substances. And his premises speak about substances, his conclusions speak about objects. But this is easily repaired in Bolzano's system. And that's why I think this is a not very important reason why the argument as formulated is invalid. It can easily be repaired and made valid, at least with respect to that issue. Because Bolzano thought that all actual objects, and that included all of them, not only substances, but also adherences, had causes and effects. And all of them interacted with all the substances of the world, right? So basically, he can add in one of the premises, maybe premise number 3, he doesn't have to be speaking about substances only. He can also be speaking about, he could also be speaking about adherences and say that it is very improbable that two adherences are going to be perfectly similar, because for that to happen, they would have to be surrounded by perfectly similar substances at the same distance, that is, substances having the same adherences at the same distance, or if not, they would have to be surrounded by substances which are dissimilar, that is, by substances that have different adherences, but somehow they cause the same effects on the adherences of the two initial substances, right? So I think that the issue with the argument can easily be repaired. But there is a more important reason why the argument is invalid, and this has to do with the step from line 4 to line 5. He is basically arguing that because PII is highly probable, PII is true, or in other words, maybe more accurate given the way I have reconstructed the argument, he is arguing that because the falsity of PII is highly improbable, the PII is true. So the problem here is that all that follows from the claim that something is maximally improbable is simply that it is maximally improbable. From the fact that something is maximally improbable, it doesn't follow that that thing is false, right? And I mean, you can see this. There is a very common example, which is, if you throw a dart to a target, the dart is going to hit one point in the target, but of course there are infinitely many points in the target. Therefore, the probability of the dart hitting any particular point in the target is 0. And 0 in the standard axioms of probability theory is maximal improbability. Nothing can be more improbable than anything having probability 0, right? So the probability of the dart hitting any point in the target is 0 for every point in the target. And yet the dart hits one among those infinitely many points. So something that had probability 0 has occurred. Something that has probability 0 is true, not false, right? And so that, in my view, shows that what is maximally improbable need not be false. And one shouldn't infer falsity, or let alone impossibility, from something having probability 0, from something being maximally improbable. Now, Bolzano doesn't speak of maximal improbability, doesn't speak of probability 0. He speaks of infinite improbability. And he doesn't tell us how to understand that. But I think the most reasonable assumption about what he meant by that is that whatever is infinitely improbable is maximally improbable, right? I take it that what he meant is nothing can be more improbable than something which is infinitely improbable. But then, as I said, I mean, he will have to say that the probability of the dart hitting any particular point in the target is infinitely low, is infinitely improbable. And yet that happens. So we shouldn't infer from something being infinitely improbable that that thing doesn't happen, let alone that it is impossible. And so the step from 4 to 5 seems to be invalid, seems to be inconclusive. But perhaps Bolzano didn't want to assert the truth of PAI. As I said at the beginning, when I was comparing Leibniz with Bolzano, I said it's very clear, at least to me, that Leibniz is arguing for the necessary truth of PAI, while Bolzano is arguing either for the truth, the unqualified truth, the modally unqualified truth of PAI, or perhaps for its high probability. So let us suppose that he was arguing for its high probability. In that case, what we need to do is to replace conclusion number 5 in the reconstruction of the argument in the handout by conclusion 5 star, right? Which says it is more probable that there are no two actual, i.e. concrete objects sharing all their internal attributes than not. In other words, 5 star says PII is more probable than the negation of PII. But even if we replace 5 by 5 star, there is still a problem with premise 3. Actually, I think there are 2 problems with premise 3. What premise 3 says, and I think this is in the handout, is it? Yes. What premise 3 says is that for every situation S in which there are 2 substances A and B surrounded by substances affecting them in the same way, 2 things must happen. A, there are infinitely many other situations in which A and B are surrounded by substances affecting them in different ways. And B, S and the infinitely many other situations are equiprobable, right? So this claim about the equiprobability between all those situations in which A and B are surrounded differently by other substances is basically an appeal, and an unsupported appeal to the principle of indifference, the principle that reality doesn't favor any particular situation over any other. Every distribution of substances across space have the same probability, the same objective probability, because reality or nature is not biased. It's not favoring any particular one. And that's why they're all equiprobable. In the same way in which if a certain die is not loaded, the probability of the die falling on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 is the same. It's in every case 1/6, right? And that's because the die is not loaded. That is because the die is not. That is because the die is indifferent as to which phase is going to is weighted, or no phase of the die is weighted. That's what I want to say. And in that sense, the die is indifferent as to how it's going to fall. But this principle of indifference is unsupported. Bolzano doesn't give any reason in the passage. And also it's very difficult to see how anyone could give any reason for it, right? At most, what we can say that all such situations should be assigned the same priors. But the priors we assign to any situation have to do not so much with the objective probability of the situation, but with what we believe about reality, what we believe about those situations, what we know about those situations, what we expect from those situations. Those things are all subjective things that relate to us, not to what reality is like, right? And that is not going to give us the principle of indifference, which is what Bolzano needs. The principle of indifference doesn't speak about our priors. It doesn't speak about how we conceptualize or how we think about different situations. It speaks about the probabilities, the objective probabilities of the situations themselves. So that is an issue. But I think there is another issue with premise 3, which is even if we grant that all those situations are equiprobable, right? Even if we agree that there is that the principle of indifference is valid. What premise 3 is saying is that the situations in which there are indiscernible substances and the situations in which there aren't are equiprobable, right? That's basically the principle of indifference, right? All of those situations are equiprobable. But then how can he conclude from that some situations are more probable than others? Namely, those situations in which PII is true, he wants to claim, are more probable than the situations in which PII is false. So that seems to be an issue there, right? He's saying, look, all these situations are equiprobable. Therefore, the situations in which PII is true are more probable than the other ones. Something is not working there. But I think there is something that could be said in support of Bolzano, and this is that maybe what he meant is not premise 3 as I stated it, but premise 3 as it is also in the handout. Premise 3 says there are infinitely many more situations in which A and B are surrounded by substances affecting them in different ways than situations in which they are surrounded by substances affecting them in the same way. And all these situations are equiprobable, right? So basically, what premise 3 said was simply that there was an infinity of situations, right? And all of them were equiprobable. This one is saying, look, there are infinitely more situations in which PII is true than those in which PII is not true. And all those situations are individually taken equiprobable. But of course, there are more of one kind than of the other. There are more situations where PII is true, infinitely more situations where PII is true than where it is not. It is still true that all the individual situations are equiprobable, but there are more of one kind than of the other. I mean, all the 6 situations where the die falls a certain way, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, are equiprobable, right? Let's say that the die is not loaded, but it is still true that there are more situations in which the die falls on a number which is equal or lesser than 5 than situations in which it falls on a number which is greater than 5. So even if the die is loaded and the probability of it falling on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is exactly the same, it's more probable that it's going to fall between a number which is either 1, 2, 3, or 5 than that it is going to fall on 6. So that's basically the idea behind 3 star. But I think there is an issue with 3 star, a big issue actually, if I am right, because I think 3 star is false. And it is false because I believe that it is not true that there are infinitely more situations in which PII is true than situations in which PII is false. And I think that that is the case, because I think that for every situation in which PII is true, there must correspond, or there corresponds, a situation in which PII is not true. And if this is the case, then the number of situations in which PII is not true cannot be less than the number of situations in which PII is true. It must be at least equal. So why do I think that to every situation in which PII is true, there corresponds a situation in which PII is not true? Well, because given any situation in which PII is true, you can think that that situation is half of a bigger situation in which the other half is qualitatively exactly similar as the original one. So let me give an example, and then the point is that the example generalizes. Suppose this room is the whole world, right? And that's surely possible. There must be a possible world which is exactly like this room is. And let us suppose that PII is true in this world. Let us suppose that no 2 objects in this room share their internal attributes, their intrinsic properties. Well, fine, but there must be another possible world which is exactly like this room, except that on that side of the world, there is another room right? Which is perfectly similar to this one. So in that other room, this world is a line or a plane of symmetry, so that what exists in the other world is a perfect duplicate of what exists in this one. So because in this room there are no perfectly similar things, no thing in this room shares all its intrinsic properties with me in this room. But in this world, there is something that shares all its intrinsic properties with me. What is the thing? Well, it's the guy perfectly similar to me speaking, saying these very same words in the other side of the room, in the other half of the, not in the other half of the room, in the other half of the world, right? And similarly, for each one of you and for each chair in this room, although there is nothing indiscernible from them in the room, there is something indiscernible from them in the world, because in the other half of the world, in the other room, there will be something sharing its intrinsic properties with each one of you, with each chair and with each table in this room, right? And that can be generalized. I mean, what I gave was just one example, right? Clearly, if the example didn't, the validity of the example didn't depend on any particular aspects of what's going on in this room. So it surely generalizes. For any situation or any world in which PII is true, you can think that there is another world in which something like that initial world is only half of the bigger world, right? And in that bigger world, there will be indiscernible things. So basically, I think that the argument, at least the way I read the argument, is either invalid or unsound. It is invalid if we think of it as an argument for the truth of PII, and it is either invalid or unsound if we think of it as an argument for the high probability of PII. Thank you.